The next thing I want to show you guys is the idea of using routing folders within ProTools in a similar way that I might create a group channel or group bus in Cubase or something like that. Sometimes trying to figure out the busing structure is different between different DAW software. So Logic is got a very strange, very weird little way of doing busing with certain kinds of things. Like the idea of a group fader is very different than Logic. They call it summing stacks, and there are certain rules that it can do and can't do. And in Pro Tools or any other DAW software is no different. But you have a couple of choices here. And the reason I want to talk about this routing folder thing is because for certain things, I'm going to use drums as an example here, it's just a little easier to control and get your head around how you want to use plugins over the same set of instruments. So like in the case of the drums here, I've got 4 microphones. I've got a kick drum, a snare drum mic, and I've got overhead left and right. So it's all mono microphone. So for the overhead left and right, if I want to put EQ on the overheads, I don't want to have to use 2 instances of an EQ plug. I'd much rather just use one and EQ all the overheads together. So, and I'll show you a couple of different examples of at least how I set up the routing folder scene here, and then I'll show you kind of what the plugin scene looks like as well. Let's start with this. So right now this is a really simple one because basically, the bass drum's just a way to isolate the bass drum. The snares just to isolate the snare, and the overheads are really the sound of a 4 mic setup of what the kit sounds like. And if I want a little more pop out of the kick drum, it's not going to get in the overheads. So I'm going to get that from the bass drum mic, and the snare I'm going to get a little more definition out of the snare drum mic. But the overheads are sort of the key thing. So what I want to do is I'm going to start by disabling the group so I can click on stuff individually, right? So what I'm going to do right above the overhead left, I'm just going to create a new track, and it's going to be a stereo track instead of mono. We've got these 2 mono microphones left and right for the overheads. So stereo, but I'm not going to do an audio track. I'm going to pick a routing folder, and then we'll name it overhead. So I'm just going to call it OH, create, right? So there's the routing folder. And then if I want, because I'm sort of super anal retentive, I want it the same color. So I select that. I'll select those 2 together, and then I'll make sure they're the same color. So now I'm happy. So now all I have to do is I can grab my left and drag it into the folder. And there's another thing you got to do. So there's left and right. Okay, but notice right now, as far as the routing for a bus kind of an idea. So right now I've got my overheads going to my main output. But I'm also got these left and right going to the main output. So what I want to do is I want to route things a little differently. What I'm going to do is I'm going to route these, instead of the output going to main output, I'm going to send it to a track and tell it to go to the overheads. And I'm going to do the same here, track overheads, right? So now these 2 individual tracks are now going to the overhead routing folder. And if I look in the mix window, here's my stereo file. Here's the mono left, mono right. They're already panned, right? And then this is all set up. And now, instead of running separate sends, like if I wanted to plug in EQ on each left and right cymbal, instead of duplicating that plugin, I can just attach it here, grab my EQ, grab my, let's see, Fab Filter, right, and then go to my little default, which is going to be there. So now I've got my EQ for my cymbals that I've already tuned to this kit, all ready to go. And instead of using twice as much CPU power to run 2 inserts, I'm just running the one. So that's the idea of it. The other thing is I can kind of tweak this stuff individually, but that's the basic part. Then the only other thing is on my group for the vintage kit, what am I soloing, right? So you might have to modify that. So right now what I've got currently in the group is, and it's a mix edit group. And this is an issue that I noticed. If I set it as a combined mix edit group, there's sometimes issues. So like here's an example. Instead of having it be, like if I want to control a fader level of the whole kit, but let's say I have this left and right mono mics in there, it's going to move just those mics, but it's not moving my little summing my group fader track that I've set up. So for what I have to do, I might have to create two groups. One is a mix group and one is an edit group, and I'll tell you why. So I'm just going to call this Vintage Kit Edit, and this is, and then make that an edit group instead. And the reason for that is if I wanted to edit the whole group, it's just picking the stuff I need to edit for the audio purposes, right? Now, if I wanted to do a mix group, what I want is I want my bass drum, my snare drum, and just the overhead, especially if I've got like a set dynamic level. So I might, instead of having it be minus 3.8 dB there, what I might do is set it there at minus 3.8 and then set these at 0. And now I can select the things I want in my mix group, and then I can, on the Mac I believe it's Command G to make a group, Control G on a PC. So now it's picked those, and I'm going to make that a mix group, and then I'm going to call that Vintage Kit Mix. When I'm mixing, you know, I can work my levels all together, and that way I've got separation between mix group and edit group. All right, so that's the simple version with just like a stereo pair like we got here with the overheads. Let's go to a different file. More complex miking setup for the drums here. So in this case, I've got a stereo overhead microphone, right? So I don't have to worry about it, you know, like what we were dealing with the other drum kit microphone setup. We've got a stereo mic as the overhead mic. I've got 4 separate toms, and then I've got kick, snare, and hat. So for things I want to have independent for getting transparency in my mix, the kick, the snare, and the hat, they're fine. The overhead, it's fine. What I want to do is make a tom rack. So out of these 4 microphones that are across the 4 toms that are on there. So I'm just going to click above the tom rack, type new, and then I'm creating one stereo track, and I'm going to call it a routing folder and call it tom rack. Okay, so there's my tom rack, and then I can grab all 4 of these guys and I can drag those into the rack, and then because I am super anal retentive, I gotta go and I gotta change my colors. Alright, and then I go back, and now all is right in the world. And then the other thing, if you recall, what I gotta do is I gotta do the outputs. Go to track, and then go to tom rack. Track, tom rack. So that's set to the tom rack, and then, you know, right now I've got this drum group, and if I'm looking at what's in it, so this would be an edit group instead of a mix edit group, right? So that would be the edit group. And then if I want my mix group, then I'm grabbing that, make a group, drums, mix, done. And I've got all that. And then the only other thing I would do is generally, you know, like in the case of what we had set up here, it was minus 2.2, right? So there. And then I can go and set all that stuff up. There's a, you know, like, so something more complex like this, you got 4 separate tom mics. And granted, these are already panned. right? So if I look in the mix window, here's our 4 toms here, and you can see they're all panned different directions and stuff like that. They're going to the stereo tom rack. But I can load in, no, I don't want to send, I want, right, I can go my EQ, I can go get my fab filter, right, and then I can go pick my toms here, right, and so that sets up, what my tom rack would be for, an entire tom track. Or if I wanted to get a very specific kind of EQ for each tom, then I would just turn that off, and then I would go to tom 1 right here, and then I would load my EQ, which is what I did on this bigger kit, right? So here we go, tom 1 through 4, right? So I have a particular setup here. There's tom 2. So notice I've got like different setups, and just, and the reason was I was EQing for the tone, trying to get a little more of the fundamental pitch out of the tom. There was a problem area where it was a little muddy, and then there was a little attack transient that I wanted to dynamically alter a little bit. And I did that on all 4 toms, and that's one example. And then if I wanted to put like a blanket reverb, then I could, create, an effects channel and then run it. But the idea is that, like on the global kinds of sends and things like that, I can just have one instance of it on the tom rack routing folder. And then if I need to do something specific on these, I got a little more control, and it allows me just a lot more powerful control over mix, and also just kind of staying organized and shaping the sound that I'm going for. So that's the benefit of this routing folder kind of a thing. Finally, let me just go to what this looks like in the end. Looks familiar, right? Same tune, but this is with all my plugins. So I've got like my little Neve channels. I've got a multiband compressor, and then I've got routing to some plate reverbs and things like that on the rack. And then I've got the EQs on each of the 4 independent toms, but I also have a channel strip. What I'm trying to do in this one is I'm simulating a Neve console by having everything on a Neve channel strip. And that way I can do custom kinds of filtering, additive EQ, things like that, as well as the subtractive EQ. And that's what it looks like. So that's everything about this routing folders concept. I like that Pro Tools has this capability. It's a nice feature and allows me more power as far as mixing choices. So that's it for this one. Talk to you guys soon.